The prison gates creaked open, and Etim Bassi stepped out with nothing but a worn shirt and 8 stolen years behind him. No one was there to greet him. No voice called his name. But hours later, standing before a broken, abandoned house at the edge of the city, he heard something that stopped his breath. Children whispering inside. He pushed the door open slowly and froze. His son, his daughter, thinner, dirt-covered, alone. They stared at him like a ghost, because to them he was one. How long had they been living like this, without him? Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if this story touches you, don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. Before prison reduced his life to a number, Etim Bassi had been a man known for quiet dignity. He was not rich, not powerful, not even particularly noticed by the world. But in the narrow, sun-warmed streets of Uyo where he lived, he was something far more meaningful. He was a father who never returned home empty-handed. A husband who spoke gently, even when the day had been cruel, and a man who believed with stubborn simplicity that honesty would one day reward him. Each morning before dawn, Etim would rise from the thin mattress he shared with his wife Ekaet, careful not to wake her too abruptly. The room they lived in was small, just one main space with a curtain dividing where the children slept, but it was always clean. Always warm with the smell of food and the faint laughter of family life. He would step outside into the cool air, stretch his aching back, and prepare for another long day at the warehouse, where he worked as a stock handler. The job was not easy. Heavy crates, long hours, supervisors who rarely remembered his name. But Etim never complained. To him, every box he lifted was another meal for his children, another school fee slowly being saved, another reason to keep going. At home, life moved in a rhythm built on love, rather than comfort. Ubong, his young son, was curious and sharp-eyed, always asking questions about the world beyond their street. Anyeti, smaller and softer, followed her brother everywhere, her laughter quick and bright, despite the patches on her dress. And Ekaet, strong, graceful Ekaet, held everything together. She sold vegetables at the local market, stretching every naira, until it seemed to multiply in her hands. In the evenings, they would gather outside their home, sitting on worn wooden stools as the sky turned orange and purple. Etim would tell stories, sometimes real, sometimes imagined, about a future where Ubong would become a great engineer, where Anyeti would wear fine dresses and walk into buildings that had doors that opened for her automatically. The children would listen with wide eyes, believing every word because it came from him. You see, Etim would say, tapping Ubong lightly on the forehead, "This mind will take you far, further than I ever went." Ubong would grin, "And I will build you a big house, Papa." Anyeti would clap. With a red door, Ekaet would smile quietly, watching them. Her eyes soft but thoughtful, as if she wanted to believe just as much, but knew how fragile dreams could be. Still, for all their struggles, they were together. And that made everything feel possible. It was on an ordinary afternoon that everything began to fall apart. The warehouse was unusually tense that day. Workers moved faster, spoke less. There had been whispers since morning, something about missing inventory, about money that didn't add up. Etim noticed the supervisors walking in and out of the office, with tight faces, their voices low and urgent. He kept working. By midday, the manager, Mr. Lawal, called several workers into the office one by one. When Etim's name was finally spoken, he wiped his hands on his worn trousers and stepped inside, unsure but calm. The room felt colder than usual. 2 men he did not recognize were standing beside the manager, well-dressed, serious, watching him, with eyes that did not feel neutral. Papers were spread across the desk. "Etim Bassi, Mr. Lawal," said, his tone clipped. "Do you know why you're here?" Etim shook his head slowly. "No, sir." One of the strangers stepped forward. "We have records showing that large quantities of goods have been removed from this warehouse without authorization. Your access code was used." Etim blinked, confused. "Sir, that cannot be. I only do my assigned work. I don't even," Your code was used, the man repeated firmer this time. And the transactions happened during your shifts. Etim's heart began to beat faster, not from guilt but from a growing, sinking fear. There must be a mistake. I don't know anything about this. Mr. Lawal avoided his eyes. Search him, the other man said. Before Etim could react, his pockets were turned out. A small envelope was pulled from his back pocket, one he had never seen before. Inside it was money, more money than he had ever held at once. The room went silent. Etim stared at it, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. That is not mine. I don't know how, but the looks on their faces had already changed. The decision had already been made. By the time the police arrived, the story had been written without him. He was taken from the warehouse in handcuffs, his protests swallowed by the noise of accusation. Workers he had greeted every day now stood at a distance, whispering. No one stepped forward. No one asked questions. By evening, the news had reached his home. Ekayet was preparing dinner when she heard the commotion outside. Voices, footsteps, then someone calling her name. She stepped out, wiping her hands on her wrapper, her heart already uneasy. What is it? She asked. A neighbor looked at her hesitant. Ekayet. They took Etim. The words didn't make sense at first. Took him, where police. They say he stole from the company. The spoon slipped from her hand. Inside, Ubong and Anyeti had followed her to the doorway, their small faces confused. Mama, Anyeti whispered. Ekayet shook her head quickly, forcing calm into her voice. Go inside, she said softly. Go and sit. But her hands were trembling. That night she went to the police station, her feet moving faster than her thoughts. She found Etim behind metal bars, his eyes searching for her the moment she appeared. Ekayet. His voice broke slightly. She moved closer, gripping the cold metal. What happened? They said you Etim. Tell me it's not true. It's not, he said immediately, desperation in every word. I didn't do anything. They're lying. I don't even understand it. She searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation, but there was none. Only fear. Only truth. I believe you, she whispered. For a moment, that was enough. But belief could not stop what was already in motion. The days that followed moved too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Court dates were set. Papers were signed. Words like evidence and theft and breach of trust filled rooms where Etim stood powerless. He kept repeating the same sentence. I didn't do it. But no one seemed to be listening. On the day of his sentencing, the courtroom was crowded but distant. Ekayet sat in the back. Her hands clasped so tightly they ached. Ubong and Anyeti sat beside her, too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel that something terrible was happening. Etim stood before the judge, his shoulders straight, despite the weight pressing down on him. 8 years, the judge said. The words landed like a final blow. Ekayet gasped softly, her body folding inward as if something inside her had broken. Ubong reached for her hand. Anyeti began to cry, quietly. Etim turned just once, looking at them. His eyes held everything he could not say. I will come back. Take care of them. Don't lose hope. But hope felt very far away. As the guards let him out, Anyeti broke free from her seat and ran forward. Papa, she cried, her small voice cutting through the courtroom. He stopped just for a second, just long enough to see her reaching for him. Then he was gone. And in that moment, without anyone realizing it yet, the slow unraveling of a family had already begun. Prison did not begin with violence for Etim Bassi. It began with silence. The first night when the heavy iron door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoed in his chest, like something final, something irreversible. He stood still in the dim light, his eyes slowly adjusting to the narrow cell, packed with unfamiliar faces. No one greeted him. No one asked questions. A few men looked at him briefly, then looked away as if he had already become just another shadow among many. Etim moved carefully to an empty space near the wall and sat down. The floor was cold, unforgiving. His body ached from the long day, but it was not the physical pain that kept him awake. It was the weight of what had just happened. 8 years. The number circled in his mind like something unreal, too large to understand. He closed his eyes, but instead of rest, he saw Anyeti's small hands reaching for him in the courtroom. He heard her voice again, calling him, breaking through the noise of everything else. Papa Etim opened his eyes quickly, breathing harder. "I will come back," he whispered under his breath. "I will come back to you." The days that followed were harsh but predictable. Prison had its own rhythm, one that did not care who you were before you arrived. The mornings came early, the work was constant, and the food was barely enough to keep a man standing. Etim learned quickly that silence was not always safety. During his second week, as he sat with his small portion of food, a larger inmate approached him. The man's presence alone was enough to shift the space around them. "You're new," the man said, looking down at him. "You don't know how things work here yet." Etim remained quiet. The man's eyes dropped to the food in Etim's hands. "Give it." For a brief moment, Etim hesitated, not out of defiance but instinct. Then slowly he handed it over. The man took it without a word and walked away. Etim sat there, his empty hands resting on his knees, the hunger already rising inside him. But more than hunger, there was something else. A quiet realization that even the smallest things were no longer his to keep. That night, lying on the thin mat, his stomach tight with emptiness, Etim made a decision. "I will survive this," he told himself, "for them." From that moment, everything he did had a purpose. He avoided trouble, observed carefully, and adapted to the unwritten rules of prison life. He took on small tasks, cleaning, carrying, fixing broken items, anything that could earn him an extra portion of food or a bit of protection. But no matter how much he adjusted, the nights remained the hardest, because the nights belonged to memory. He would lie awake staring at the cracked ceiling and rebuild his family piece by piece in his mind. Ubong's curious eyes always asking how things worked. Anyeti's laughter soft and bright even on the hardest days. Ekayet's quiet strength, the way she would sit beside him after a long day and say nothing, yet somehow say everything. Those memories became his only comfort, and his greatest pain. Weeks turned into months. Ekayet came to visit him at first. The first time she appeared behind the barrier, Etim felt something inside him steady again. She looked tired, more tired than he had ever seen her. But when their eyes met, she smiled. "I told you," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough strength. "I believe you." Etim swallowed hard. "How are the children?" "They are holding on," she replied. "Ubong is helping me. Anyeti asks about you every day." Etim closed his eyes briefly. "Tell her I will come back. Tell her I am strong." Ekayet nodded. "I will." Her visits were never long, never enough, but they gave him something to hold on to. A reminder that he was not forgotten, that somewhere beyond the walls his family was still there. He began to count time through her visits. Each one was a marker, a small light in the darkness. Then one day she did not come. At first Etim did not worry. Life outside was difficult. Maybe she had been delayed. Maybe something had come up at the market. She will come next time, he told himself. But the next visiting day came, and she did not come. A quiet unease settled in his chest. By the third missed visit, that unease had grown into something heavier, something harder to ignore. Etim began asking questions, but answers were scarce. The guards knew nothing or said nothing. Other inmates only shrugged. Days stretched into weeks. Still no Ekayet, no message, no explanation. The silence returned heavier than before. Etim sat alone one evening, his thoughts spiraling. What if something happened, he wondered. What if she is sick? What if the children... He stopped himself. "No," he said firmly under his breath. "They are strong. Ekayet is strong." But doubt had already taken root. Without her visits, time lost its shape. The days blurred together, each one feeling longer than the last. The hope he had clung to began to thin slowly, quietly. At night the memories changed. They were no longer just comfort. They became questions. Where are they? Why haven't they come? Are they safe? He replayed every moment he had shared with them, searching for something he had missed. A sign, a warning, anything that could explain the silence. But there was nothing, only absence. One evening, as Etim sat after a long day of labor, an older inmate approached him. The man had been watching him quietly for some time. "You are the one who says he is innocent," the man said. Etim looked up. "I am." The man studied him carefully. "I have seen many men here. Some lie, some don't. You don't look like a thief." Etim gave a faint, tired smile. "That is because I am not." The man lowered himself beside him. "Then you must hold on to that, because this place will try to take it from you." Etim nodded slowly. After a pause, he spoke again. "My family. They have stopped coming. I don't know why." The older man's expression softened slightly. "Outside these walls, life is not easy. Sometimes people disappear not because they want to, but because they have no choice." Etim shook his head. "Not them. They would not leave me." The man did not argue. He simply placed a hand briefly on Etim's shoulder. "Then survive," he said quietly. "Survive long enough to find out the truth." Etim sat there, the words settling deep inside him. Survive. That night, lying in the darkness, Etim stared at the ceiling, his mind heavy but steady. No matter what had happened, no matter how long it took, he would endure. Because somewhere beyond those walls, his children were still there. And until he saw them again with his own eyes, he would not allow himself to believe anything else. Outside the prison walls, life did not pause for Eke Bassi. It pressed forward, harder, colder, and far less forgiving than anything Etim could imagine from inside his cell. The day after Etim was taken away, Eke woke before sunrise, just as she always had. For a brief moment, as she sat up from the thin mattress, she reached to the side out of habit, expecting to feel Etim there beside her. But there was only empty space. She froze her hand, resting on the worn fabric, her chest tightening as reality returned all over again. "Mama," a small voice called. Agneti stood at the doorway, her eyes still heavy with sleep, her hair messy, her face innocent in a way that made Ekaet's heart ache. Ekaet forced a smile. "Come here." Agneti ran into her arms and Ekaet held her tightly longer than usual. Ubong stood behind quieter, watching everything with eyes that seemed older than they should have been. "Is Papa coming today?" Agneti asked softly. Ekaet swallowed, her throat dry. "Not today," she replied gently. But soon. She didn't know if that was true, but she needed them to believe it. At first, she tried to keep everything as normal as possible. She went to the market, set up her small vegetable stall, and called out to customers like she always had. But things were different now. People looked at her differently. Some whispered, some avoided her entirely. "That is the wife of the thief," one woman muttered, not even trying to lower her voice. Ekaete pretended not to hear. But the words stayed. Sales dropped. Regular customers stopped coming. Even those who still bought from her did so quickly, without conversation, without the small kindnesses that used to make the long days easier. By the end of the week, Ekaet returned home with less money than she had ever earned. Still, she tried. She stretched every coin. She reduced their meals from 3 a day to 2, then sometimes 1. At night, when the children slept, she would sit quietly, counting what little remained her mind, racing through possibilities that always ended the same way, with nothing. Weeks passed. The landlord came. He stood at the doorway, his presence filling the small space with quiet authority. "You are behind on rent," he said flatly. Ekaet nodded, her hands clasped tightly. "I know. Please give me a little more time. I will pay." The man looked around the room, the worn furniture, the thin mattress, the two children sitting silently in the corner. "You have 1 week," he said. "After that, I cannot help you." Then he left. Ekayet stood there for a long time after he was gone. 1 week. She turned to look at Ubong and Anyeti. They were watching her, waiting. "It's okay," she said quickly, forcing strength into her voice. "We will be fine." But inside, fear had already begun to grow. She worked harder. She stayed longer at the market even when there were no customers. She tried to sell in different areas, carrying her goods from street to street, calling out until her voice became hoarse. Some days she earned just enough to buy a small portion of food. Other days, nothing. Then Anyeti fell sick. It started with a small fever. Ekayet noticed it when she touched her daughter's forehead one evening. "You're warm," she said softly. "I'm okay," Mama Anyeti whispered, trying to smile. But by morning the fever had worsened. Ekayet wrapped her in a cloth and rushed to a nearby clinic, her heart pounding with every step. Inside, the nurse barely looked up. "You need to pay first," she said. Ekayet hesitated. "Please, I don't have enough right now. I will bring it. Just help her." The nurse shook her head. "We cannot treat without payment." Ekayet stood there, holding her burning child, her mind spinning. "Please," she tried again, her voice breaking. "She is just a child." But the answer did not change. Slowly, she turned and walked out. That night she sat beside Anyeti, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth, whispering soft words of comfort. She wasn't sure she believed herself. Ubong sat nearby, silent, watching. "Will she be okay?" he asked quietly. Ekayet nodded quickly. "Yes, she will." But her hands were shaking. The next day she made a decision. She took the small gold earrings Etim had once given her, the only valuable thing she still had, and sold them. The money was not much, but it was enough. Anyeti received treatment. The fever slowly began to drop. Ekayet should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something else. She had nothing left. No savings, no valuables, no support, and the rent was still due. The week passed faster than she could keep up with. When the landlord returned, Ekayet stood at the doorway, her heart heavy. "I tried," she said softly. "Please, just a little more time." The man sighed, not unkindly, but firmly. "I cannot wait any longer." By evening, their belongings, what little they had, were placed outside. Ubong stood beside them, his fists clenched. Anyeti held onto Ekayet's wrapper, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Where will we go?" Ubong asked. Ekayet looked at them. For a moment she said nothing, because she did not know. They stayed with a distant relative for a short time, but it did not last. The space was small, the welcome thin. "You cannot stay here forever," the woman said one morning. "I have my own children to feed." And so they left again. Days blurred into each other. They moved from place to place, sometimes sleeping in unfinished buildings, sometimes under market stalls after closing. Ekayet did everything she could to shield the children from the worst of it. But there were limits to what she could protect them from. Hunger became a constant presence. Fear followed close behind. And slowly, something inside Ekayet began to break. She stopped visiting Etim. At first it was because she could not afford the transport. Then, because she could not bear to face him without answers, without hope, without anything to give. "How do I tell him?" she whispered to herself one night as the children slept beside her on a hard floor. "How do I tell him everything is falling apart?" The guilt grew heavier each day. She began to withdraw her thoughts, turning darker, her strength fading. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the streets grew quieter, Ekayet sat, with Ubong and Anyeti, beside an unfinished building. Ubong looked at her. "Mama, are we going home?" The question cut deeper than anything else. Ekayet stared ahead, her eyes distant. Then slowly she turned to them. Her voice, when she spoke, was softer than they had ever heard it. "Listen to me carefully," she said. Ubong straightened. Anyeti clung to her. You are strong, Ekayet continued. Both of you, stronger than you know. Ubong frowned slightly. Mama. What do you mean? Ekayet's eyes filled with tears. But she did not let them fall. You must take care of each other, she said. Anyeti shook her head. No, Mama. Ekayet pulled them both into her arms, holding them tightly as if trying to memorize the feeling. I love you, she whispered. Those were the last words she said to them that night, because before morning came, Ekayet was gone. The first morning without Ekayet did not feel real. Ubong woke before the sun had fully risen, the air still cool and quiet around the unfinished building where they had slept. For a moment, everything felt normal. He turned slightly, expecting to see his mother sitting nearby, maybe preparing something small for them to eat or watching over them the way she always did. But she wasn't there. He blinked, sitting up slowly. Mama, he called. No answer. Beside him, Anyeti stirred, rubbing her eyes. Mama, she echoed softly. Ubong stood up, his heart beginning to beat faster. He looked around the empty space, the cracked walls, the scattered debris, the faint light slipping through the broken structure. She was gone. She must have gone to get food, Ubong said quickly, more to convince himself than his sister. Anyeti nodded, holding on to that idea, as if it were something solid. Yes. Mama will come back. They waited. The sun rose higher, and the heat of the day began to settle over the city. People passed by in the distance, going about their lives, unaware of the two children sitting quietly in the corner of a broken building, watching the road with hopeful eyes. Hours passed. She's taking long, Anyeti whispered. Ubong swallowed. She will come. But his voice had changed. By afternoon, the hunger began to return. Their stomachs tightened, reminding them of how little they had eaten the day before. Ubong stood up. Stay here, he said. Anyeti grabbed his arm immediately. No, don't leave me. I'm just going to look, he said gently. I won't go far. She hesitated, then slowly let go. Ubong stepped outside his eyes, scanning the street. He walked a little distance, looking in every direction, hoping to catch a glimpse of Ekayet's familiar figure. But she was nowhere. He returned, his face more serious now. She's not here, he said quietly. Anyeti's eyes filled with tears. She will come back. Right. Ubong didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, really, looked at her. She was small, fragile, afraid, and in that moment something inside him shifted. I'm here, he said instead. I will take care of you. Anyeti nodded slowly, though the fear in her eyes remained. That was the day. Everything changed. They stayed in the unfinished building for 2 more nights, waiting, hoping. Each sound made them turn their heads, each passing figure made their hearts lift for a second. But Ekayet did not return. By the 3rd day, Ubong knew they could not stay there anymore. We need to find somewhere safer, he said. Where Anyeti asked. He didn't know, but he could not let her see that. They gathered what little they had, a small cloth, a broken cup, a piece of fabric they used as a blanket, and stepped out into the street. The city felt different now. Louder, harder, less forgiving. People moved around them quickly, focused on their own lives. Some glanced at the children briefly, then looked away. Others didn't look at all. Ubong held Anyeti's hand tightly. Stay close, he said. They walked for hours, their feet growing tired, their stomachs empty. The sun burned overhead and the noise of the city pressed in from all sides. At some point they reached the edge of a quieter area. Older buildings, some abandoned, some barely standing. Ubong stopped in front of one of them. The house looked like it had been forgotten. The roof sagged slightly, parts of the wall were cracked, and the door hung loosely on one hinge. Anyeti looked at it uncertainly. Can we stay here? Ubong hesitated. It wasn't safe, it wasn't clean, it wasn't a home. But it was something. We can try, he said. They pushed the door open slowly. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space. Inside, dust covered everything. Broken pieces of furniture lay scattered around. The air smelled stale, untouched for a long time. Anyeti moved closer to Ubong. "It's scary, I know," he said softly. "But we will stay together." They chose a corner of the room, where the floor seemed less damaged. Ubong used the piece of fabric to clear a small space, then spread it out. "This is where we will sleep," he said. Anyeti sat down slowly, her eyes still moving around the room. "Will Mama find us here?" she asked. Ubong paused. Then he nodded. "Yes, she will." That night was the hardest. The darkness inside the house felt heavier than outside. Every small sound, the wind, distant footsteps, the creak of old wood felt louder, closer. Anyeti clung to Ubong, her body trembling slightly. "I'm scared," she whispered. Ubong wrapped his arms around her. "I'm here." He didn't sleep. He stayed awake, listening, watching, trying to protect her from things he could not see. The hunger returned stronger the next day. Ubong knew they needed food. "Stay here," he said again. Anyeti shook her head quickly. "No." He sighed softly. "Then come with me. But don't let go." They walked back toward the busier streets, moving slowly, unsure. At first, Ubong tried to ask. "Please, do you have food?" he said to a woman passing by. She ignored him. He tried again with someone else. No answer. Anyeti tugged at his hand. "I'm hungry," she said quietly. Ubong looked around desperately. Then he saw a small pile of discarded items near a roadside stall. Leftover food, partially eaten, thrown away. He hesitated. Then he walked toward it. He picked up what he could find, brushing off dirt as best as he could. Anyeti watched him, her eyes wide. "It's okay," he said quickly. "It's still good." She nodded, though her face showed uncertainty. They ate in silence. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Days turned into a routine. Every morning they left the abandoned house to search for food. Sometimes they found scraps. Sometimes a kind stranger gave them something small. Other times they went back with nothing. At night they returned to the house. Ubong always checked the space before letting Anyeti enter, as if trying to make it safe. But safety was an illusion. One evening as they sat together, Anyeti leaned against him. "Do you think Papa knows where we are?" she asked. Ubong looked down at her. "He will find us," he said. "You promise?" He hesitated. Then he nodded. "I promise." Anyeti smiled faintly and closed her eyes. Ubong stayed awake a little longer, staring into the darkness. He did not know if his promise was true, but it was the only thing he had to give her. And so, inside a broken house at the edge of a city that had forgotten them, two children learned how to survive, one day at a time. Life inside the abandoned house did not improve. It only became something the children slowly learned to endure. The days blurred together, marked only by hunger, heat, and the quiet effort to survive. Ubong stopped counting time. There was no calendar, no school bell, no voice calling them home. There was only morning when they left to search for food, and night when they returned to the broken house that had become their shelter. At first, Ubong tried to keep things the way they used to be. "Sit here," he would say to Anyeti, clearing a small space for her like their mother once did. "I'll find something." He would try to smile, try to sound strong. He told her stories at night, just like Etim had done stories about a future, where they would live in a big house where she would have dresses in every color, where they would never go hungry again. Anyeti listened, her head resting on his shoulder, her trust unbroken. But reality kept pressing in. Food became harder to find. People began to notice them, not with kindness, but with suspicion. Some chased them away from stalls. Others shouted when they came too close. "Go away," a man yelled one afternoon as Ubong reached toward a pile of leftovers. "Don't touch that." Ubong pulled his hand back quickly, grabbing Anyeti's hand and moving away without a word. They walked in silence for a while. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Anyeti shook her head. "It's not your fault." But her voice was weaker than before. That was when Ubong began to change. He stopped asking. Instead, he watched. He learned which stalls threw away food at the end of the day. He learned which streets were quieter where fewer people would chase them away. He learned how to move quickly, how to take what he could without being seen. It wasn't something he wanted to learn, but it was something he had to. One evening, he returned to the house with a small piece of bread and a half-empty bottle of water. Anyeti's eyes lit up slightly. "You found something." Ubong nodded, handing it to her. "Eat." "What about you?" she asked. "I already ate," he said. It was a lie, but she didn't argue. She took a small bite, chewing slowly, trying to make it last. Ubong watched her, his stomach aching, but he said nothing. Days later, the sickness began. It started quietly. Anyeti complained of being tired. She moved slower, spoke less. At night she would curl up closer to Ubong, her body seeking warmth even in the heat. "You're okay," Ubong said one evening, touching her forehead. But she wasn't. By morning, her skin felt hot. Ubong's heart began to race. "No," he whispered. "No, no." He remembered the clinic, the way their mother had rushed her there, the way they had needed money. Money they didn't have. Anyeti opened her eyes slowly. "I'm fine," she murmured. But her voice was weak. Ubong stood up quickly. "Stay here. I'll find help." He ran, for the first time since everything had fallen apart. He didn't think about being chased away or ignored. He didn't think about pride or fear. He just ran. He went to the nearest street, stopping people, his voice shaking. "Please, my sister is sick. Please help." Some looked at him briefly, then walked past. Others didn't stop at all. One man shook his head. "Go to a clinic. I don't have money," Ubong said desperately. The man kept walking. Ubong felt something inside him begin to break. He ran again, moving from one place to another, his breathing heavy, his mind racing. "Please," he repeated, "please." But the answers were always the same. Nothing. After what felt like hours, he slowed down. He stood in the middle of the street, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his eyes scanning everything around him. People moved past him like he wasn't there. Cars passed, voices filled the air, but none of it mattered, because back in that broken house, Anyeti was alone. Ubong turned and ran back. When he reached the house, he pushed the door open quickly. Anyeti. She was still there, lying where he had left her. Her eyes opened slowly when she heard his voice. "Ubong," she whispered. He dropped to his knees beside her. "I'm here." Her face was flushed, her breathing uneven. "I'm okay," she said again, trying to smile. Ubong shook his head, his eyes filling with tears he tried to hold back. "No, you're not." He looked around the room, his mind searching for something, anything that could help. There was nothing, no medicine, no water left, no one. He sat beside her, holding her hand. "I won't leave you," he said quietly. Anyeti nodded weakly. "Don't go. I won't." That night, Ubong did not sleep. He stayed awake, wiping her forehead with a piece of cloth he had dampened earlier, whispering to her whenever she stirred. "You're strong," he said. "You'll be okay." But his voice trembled. At some point in the night, Anyeti gripped his hand weakly. "Do you think Papa knows?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ubong closed his eyes for a moment. "He will know," he said softly. "He will find us." "You promise?" she whispered. He hesitated. Then he nodded. "I promise." Anyeti relaxed slightly, her breathing slowing as she drifted in and out of sleep. Ubong sat there, staring into the darkness. For the first time, fear fully settled inside him. Not the kind of fear that comes and goes, but the kind that stays. Because he understood something now. There was no one coming to help them. Not today, not tomorrow. And if he didn't find a way, He might lose the only person he had left. As the night stretched on, Ubong made a decision. Whatever it took, whatever he had to do, he would not let Anyeti die. Even if it meant stepping into a world he didn't understand. Even if it meant risking everything, because he had already lost too much, and he was not ready to lose her too. Inside the prison, time did not move forward. It pressed down. For Etembasi, the days had begun to lose their edges. Morning and night felt the same, marked only by routine and the slow erosion of certainty. The silence from outside had settled into something permanent now. No visits, no messages, no sign of Ekayet or the children. He still worked, he still obeyed, he still endured, but something inside him had shifted. The hope that had once been clear and steady had become something fragile, thin like a thread, stretched too far. It was during a late afternoon, after hours of hauling broken crates across the yard, that Etim first heard the name. Bassi. He turned. A man stood a short distance away watching him. Etim recognized him vaguely, an older inmate, quiet, someone who rarely spoke to anyone. His name, Etim would later learn, was Okan Etuk. "You are Etim Bassi," the man said, stepping closer. Etim nodded slowly. "Yes." Okan studied him carefully, his eyes sharp in a way that did not belong to someone who had accepted prison life. "I have been watching you," he said. Etim frowned slightly. Why Okan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around briefly, making sure no one was paying attention. "Because your story is wrong," he said quietly. Etim's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Okan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You were convicted for stealing from the warehouse, using your access code." Etim's eyes narrowed. "Yes, but I did not—" "I know," Okan interrupted. The words hung between them. Etim stared at him. "How do you know?" Okan exhaled slowly, as if deciding how much to say. "Because I worked in that warehouse," he said. "Not long before you." Etim felt his heartbeat quicken. "I don't remember you," he said. "You wouldn't," Okan replied. "I left before your time, but I know how that place works, and I know the men who run it." Etim stepped closer. "Then tell me, what happened?" Okan's expression hardened slightly. "There are things that happen there that never reach the surface," he said. "Goods disappear, records are changed, and when something goes wrong, someone has to take the fall." Etim's breath caught. "You're saying—" He struggled to finish the thought. "I'm saying you were chosen," Okan said plainly. The words hit harder than any blow. Etim shook his head slowly. No, there must be a mistake. They found money on me. Evidence planted," Okan said without hesitation. Silence fell between them. For a long moment, Etim said nothing. His mind raced, replaying everything: the envelope, the accusations, the way the manager had avoided his eyes. "You're sure?" he asked finally, his voice low. Okan nodded. "I have seen it before." Etim took a step back, running a hand over his face. For 8 years he had held on to one belief, that the truth would somehow be seen, that someone would realize the mistake. But now, this wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. "Why?" Etim whispered. "Why me?" Okan shrugged slightly. "Because you were easy, quiet, no connections, no one to fight for you." Etim felt something rise inside him, something he had kept buried all this time. Not anger, not yet, but something close. "I have a family," he said, his voice tightening. "A wife, children." Okan looked at him, and for the first time there was something like understanding in his eyes. "Then you must hold on to that," he said. "Because if you don't, this place will take everything else." Etim nodded slowly. "But, listen carefully," Okan continued. "If you were set up, then someone outside knows the truth, and as long as they remain free, they will make sure the truth stays buried." Etim's jaw tightened. "Then, I will expose it." Okan gave a faint, almost bitter smile. From in here, Etim didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know how. Days passed after that conversation, but nothing felt the same. The prison walls hadn't changed. The routines were the same. The faces were the same. But Etim's understanding of his own story had shifted. He wasn't just a man who had been wrongly accused. He was a man who had been deliberately erased. And somewhere outside those walls, the people responsible were still living freely. At night, the thoughts came harder, not just about his children, but about the truth. Who had done this? Who had placed the money? Who had used his access code? And why had no one questioned it? He began to notice things he hadn't before. The way certain guards treated specific inmates with quiet respect. The way some prisoners received privileges, others didn't. The quiet exchanges that happened in corners unnoticed by most. There was a system inside the prison, just like there had been one outside, and both systems protected those with power. One evening, Etim sat alone, his thoughts heavy, when Okan approached him again. "You've been thinking," Okan said. Etim nodded. "I cannot stop." "That is dangerous," Okan replied. "Thinking too much in a place like this can break a man." Etim looked at him, "Or it can wake him up." Okan studied him for a moment, then sat down beside him. "There is something else you should know," he said quietly. Etim's attention sharpened. "What?" "The man who owns that warehouse," Okan said. "He is not just a businessman." Etim frowned. "What do you mean?" Okan leaned closer. "He has connections, powerful ones, politicians, security forces, people who make problems disappear." Etim felt a chill run through him. "Do you know his name?" he asked. Okan hesitated for a moment. Then he said it. Chief Bako Danjuma. The name meant nothing to Etim at first, but the way Okan said it, the weight behind it, made it clear. This was not just a man, this was a system. Etim exhaled slowly, his mind trying to process everything. "So even if the truth exists," he said, "no one will speak it." Okan nodded. "Not without risk." Silence settled again. Etim stared at the ground, his thoughts moving faster now. For the first time since his imprisonment, something inside him began to change. Not hope, something stronger. Determination. "If I get out of here," he said slowly, "I will find the truth." Okan looked at him carefully. "And if the truth destroys what you have left," Etim didn't hesitate. "I have already lost too much," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Okan nodded once as if accepting something unspoken. "Then survive," he said again. "Because that is the first step." That night, as Etim lay on his mat staring into the darkness, his thoughts were no longer only about survival. They were about purpose. Somewhere outside those walls, his children were living a life he could not see. And somewhere else, the man who had destroyed his life was still free. Etim closed his eyes slowly. "I will come back," he whispered again. But this time, the words meant more than just returning. They meant finding the truth. They meant reclaiming what had been taken. And for the first time in a long time, Etim did not feel completely powerless. Far from the prison walls, in a part of the city where buildings stood taller and streets were quieter, Inyobong Essien sat at a small wooden desk covered in files no one else wanted. She was not the kind of lawyer people rushed to hire. Not yet. Fresh out of law school, with more determination than connections, she worked at a modest legal aid office that handled cases others considered hopeless. People came to her when they had nowhere else to go, when the system had already decided their fate. Most days the work was exhausting. Endless paperwork, endless stories of injustice, endless reminders of how easily truth could be buried beneath power. But Inyobong stayed, because somewhere deep inside her, she refused to believe that justice belonged only to the wealthy. It was on a quiet afternoon, when the office had nearly emptied, that Etim's case first found its way to her desk. It wasn't presented as anything special. Just another file, another name, another conviction. Etim Bassi, she read softly. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the summary. Warehouse theft, unauthorized access, recovered money, 8-year sentence. It looked straightforward. Too straightforward. Inyobong frowned slightly, leaning back in her chair. "Something is missing," she murmured. She had learned in her short time working that the simplest cases were often the ones hiding the most. She read it again, then again. Details began to stand out, not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. No clear witness testimony, no detailed explanation of how the access code had been used, no proper chain of evidence for the money supposedly found on him. Her fingers tapped lightly on the desk. This doesn't make sense. She reached for another file, similar cases from the same warehouse company. At first, she found nothing unusual. Then on the third file, something caught her attention. Another employee, another accusation of theft. Different name, but similar pattern. Access code used, money found, quick conviction. Her eyes narrowed. That's not coincidence. She pulled more files, her movements quicker now, her focus sharpening. One after another, small inconsistencies began to form a pattern. Not enough to prove anything outright, but enough to raise questions. Dangerous questions. "Who benefits from this?" she whispered. The answer came quietly. Not the workers, not the accused. The company. Inyobong sat back, her mind racing. If this was what she thought it was, then Atim Bassi was not just a victim of a mistake. He was part of something larger, something intentional. She closed the file slowly, then opened it again. This time she wasn't just reading, she was investigating. The next day, Inyobong visited the prison. The air felt heavier as she walked through the gates, the reality of the place settling around her. She had been inside prisons before, but each visit carried its own weight. "Who are you here to see?" the guard asked. "Atim Bassi." The guard glanced at a list, then nodded. "Wait." Minutes later, Atim was brought into the visiting area. He looked older than the photo in the file, not just in appearance but in presence. His shoulders carried something heavy, something that had settled deep over time. When he sat down across from her, his eyes searched her face, uncertain. "I'm Inyobong Essen," she said gently. "I'm a lawyer." Atim blinked slightly as if the word didn't immediately connect to him. "I didn't ask for a lawyer," he said. "I know," she replied. "But I asked for you." That caught his attention. "Why?" he asked. Inyobong placed the file on the table between them. "Because I think you were wrongly convicted." Silence. Atim stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he let out a breath. "I have been saying that for years," he said quietly. Inyobong nodded. "I believe you." The words hung there, unfamiliar, almost fragile. Atim studied her face, searching for doubt. There was none. "Why now?" he asked. "Why does it matter now?" Inyobong hesitated for a moment. "Because I think your case is not the only one," she said. "And if I'm right, then someone has been using the system to cover something much bigger." Atim's jaw tightened slightly. He thought of Okon, of the warehouse, of the name that had begun to echo in his mind. "Chief Bako Danjuma," he said. Inyobong's eyes sharpened. "You know the name," Atim nodded slowly. "I heard it here. Someone said he owns the warehouse." Inyobong leaned back slightly, her thoughts aligning. "That confirms it," she murmured. Atim leaned forward. "Can you prove it?" Inyobong met his gaze. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I'm going to try." Atim held her eyes for a moment longer. Then he nodded. For the first time in years, someone was not just listening. They were acting. Over the next weeks, Inyobong worked relentlessly. She visited the warehouse, posing as a routine inspector. She asked questions, reviewed records, requested access logs. Most people gave her what she needed without thinking twice, but not everyone. "There are documents you don't have clearance for," one supervisor told her firmly. Inyobong smiled politely. "Then I'll request it formally." The man didn't smile back. That was when she knew she was getting closer. She dug deeper. She tracked financial records, compared employee logs, looked for patterns others had ignored. And, Slowly, the picture became clearer. Access codes were being duplicated. Transactions were being altered. Evidence was being planted. It wasn't random. It was systematic. And at the center of it all, Chief Bako Danjuma. One evening, as Iniobong sat alone in her office, reviewing her notes, she felt something she hadn't expected. Fear. Because this was no longer just a legal case. This was power, and power did not like to be exposed. Her phone buzzed suddenly. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello." A voice spoke on the other end, calm, controlled. "You are looking into matters that do not concern you." Iniobong's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Who is this?" she asked. The voice ignored the question. "Some doors are closed for a reason," it continued. "You should consider leaving this case." The line went dead. Iniobong sat there, the silence heavy around her. Her heart was beating faster now. This was real. Whatever she had uncovered, it had been noticed. She looked down at the file in front of her. Etimbasi, 8 years, a life taken. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "I'm not walking away," she said softly. Because she knew something now. This wasn't just about Etim. It was about every person who had been silenced. And if she stopped, then nothing would ever change. Iniobong Essien did not sleep much after the call. The voice had been calm, too calm. Not angry, not rushed. It carried the kind of confidence that came from knowing power did not need to shout. That was what unsettled her most. By morning, the fear had not disappeared, but something else had settled in its place. Clarity. She arrived at her office earlier than usual, the city still stretching awake outside. The air felt different to her now, every sound sharper, every movement more deliberate. She closed the door behind her and spread the files across her desk. Etimbasi, 3 other similar cases, warehouse access logs, financial discrepancies. Individually, they were fragments. Together, they formed something dangerous. "Follow the pattern," she whispered to herself. That had always been her instinct. Not to chase noise, but to follow consistency. And the pattern was clear. Every accused worker had low status. No influence, no legal representation strong enough to push back. Each case had been processed quickly, cleanly, quietly, too quietly, and behind all of them the same company. Owned by the same man, Chief Bako Danjuma. Iniobong leaned back in her chair, her fingers pressing lightly against her temple. "If I go straight at him, I lose," she said, under her breath. "I need something he cannot deny. Evidence, not suspicion, not patterns. Proof. That meant witnesses. Real people who had seen something, heard something, survived something." She reached for one of the older files and found a name. Samuel Idowu, former warehouse employee. Convicted, served 3 years, released. Her eyes sharpened. He's out. That was where she would start. Samuel lived in a narrow part of the city where the buildings leaned into each other like they were too tired to stand alone. The streets were crowded, noisy, alive with movement, but beneath it all there was a quiet heaviness. Iniobong asked around until someone pointed her toward a small repair shop. "That's him," a woman said. "But he doesn't talk much." Iniobong nodded and approached slowly. Samuel sat outside the shop working on a broken fan, his hands steady but his eyes distant. When she introduced herself, he didn't look surprised. "I know why you're here," he said before she could finish. Iniobong paused. "You do?" He nodded once. "About the warehouse." She sat down across from him. "Yes." Samuel continued working for a moment before speaking again. "You want to know if I stole anything," he said. "No," Iniobong replied quietly. "I want to know if you were set up." That made him stop. For the first time, he looked directly at her. "They told me no one would ever ask that," he said. Iniobong held his gaze. "I'm asking now." Silence stretched between them. Then Samuel let out a slow breath. "I didn't steal anything," he said. But that didn't matter. Tell me what happened, Inyobong said gently. Samuel leaned back slightly, his hands resting on his knees. It was the same as your file, he began. They said my access code was used, said goods went missing during my shift. Then they found money in my locker. Inyobong nodded slowly. And you didn't put it there. Samuel gave a short, bitter laugh. If I had that kind of money, I wouldn't still be working there. What about witnesses, she asked. Anyone who could support you. Samuel's expression hardened slightly. There was someone, he said. A supervisor. He knew something wasn't right. He told me quietly that my code had been used while I wasn't even on the floor. Inyobong leaned forward. What happened to him? Samuel looked away. He stopped talking, he said. Next thing I heard, he was transferred. Then, gone. Gone, Inyobong repeated. Samuel shrugged slightly. That's how things work. The words settled heavily. Would you be willing to testify? Inyobong asked carefully. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. No. Inyobong felt a small drop in her chest. Why? Samuel looked at her, his eyes tired. Because I have a family now, he said. Because I survived, and because I know what happens to people who speak too loudly about men like Bako Danjuma. Inyobong didn't argue. She understood. But she also knew this meant her path had just become harder. Back in her office, Inyobong reviewed everything again. No direct witness, no official record of manipulation. Only patterns, only fragments, not enough. Her phone buzzed again. This time she didn't recognize the number, but she already knew. She answered. You're persistent, the same voice said. Inyobong remained silent. You spoke to Samuel Idowu, the voice continued. That was unwise. A chill ran through her. You're watching me, she asked. A soft chuckle came through the line. You are not as invisible as you think, the voice replied. This is your final warning. Walk away. The line went dead again. Inyobong stared at her phone. This wasn't just pressure anymore. It was surveillance, which meant one thing. She was getting close. That evening, Inyobong made a decision. If witnesses were afraid to speak, then she needed something else. Something that could not be silenced. Records. Digital evidence. She returned to the warehouse this time with a formal request for internal audit logs. The manager, Mr. Lawal, met her at the entrance, his smile tight. You again, he said. Just doing my job, Inyobong replied calmly. He nodded slowly. Of course. But his eyes said something different. Inside, she was given limited access. Enough to look legitimate, but not enough to uncover anything meaningful. Or so they thought. Because Inyobong had already prepared. While reviewing the visible records, she quietly noted inconsistencies, timestamps that didn't match entries that appeared duplicated. Then, when left alone for a brief moment, she accessed a secondary terminal. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She copied a portion of the access logs onto a small device she had brought with her. Her heart was pounding as she slipped it back into her bag. If she was caught, she didn't finish the thought. When she left the building, the air felt heavier, like something had shifted. That night in her apartment, Inyobong sat at her desk, the device connected to her laptop. She opened the files. Lines of data filled the screen. At first it looked ordinary. Then she saw it. Repeated access entries using the same codes, simultaneous logins, impossible timestamps. Her breath caught. This is it, she whispered. Proof. Not complete, not yet, but real. For the first time she had something that could not be easily dismissed, something that could begin to break the system open. But as she stared at the screen, another thought crept in. If she had found this, then they would soon realize something was missing, and when they did, she would no longer be just a nuisance. She would be a threat. Inyobong closed her laptop slowly, her mind already moving to the next step. Court. It was time to bring the truth into the open, no matter the cost. By the time the rains came, Ubong had already learned how to read the sky. Dark clouds did not mean relief. They meant trouble. The abandoned house could not keep water out. The roof sagged in places, and when the rain grew heavy, it found its way through every weakness, dripping then pouring, turning their small corner into damp ground that never fully dried. That evening, the wind came first. It pushed through the broken windows carrying dust and the smell of coming rain. Anieti sat close to the wall, her arms wrapped around herself. "Ubong," she said softly. "It's going to rain again." Ubong nodded, already moving. He gathered what little they had, the cloth, the broken cup, a piece of plastic he had found days earlier, and tried to cover the corner where they slept. "It will be okay," he said. But his voice lacked certainty. The rain began suddenly, heavy, loud, unforgiving. Water leaked through the roof in several places, forming small streams that ran across the floor. The wind howled outside, making the loose door slam and creak. Anieti flinched at the sound. Ubong moved closer, pulling her into his arms. "I'm here." They sat like that for a long time, listening to the storm. But the rain brought more than cold. It brought weakness. Anieti's fever had never fully gone away. Some days she seemed better. She would sit up, speak a little more, even smile faintly at Ubong's stories. But other days she could barely move. Her body drained, her eyes heavy. That night was one of the worst ones. Her skin burned again. Her breathing grew uneven. "Ubong," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I feel strange." Ubong's chest tightened. He touched her forehead and his hand pulled back quickly. She was too hot. "No," he said quietly. "Not again." He looked around the room, his mind racing. There was nothing, no medicine, no clean water, no help. He swallowed hard. "I'll get something," he said. Anieti's fingers tightened around his shirt weakly. "Don't go." Ubong hesitated. Then he gently loosened her grip. "I'll come back fast, I promise." She nodded, slowly, her eyes already closing. Ubong stood up and ran. The rain hit him immediately, soaking his clothes, making the ground slippery beneath his feet. But he didn't slow down. He ran through the streets, his heart pounding louder than the storm. Think, he told himself. Think. He remembered the market, the stalls, the places where people sometimes threw away food. But this time food wasn't enough. He needed money. He needed medicine. And he knew what that meant. He stopped under a small shelter, breathing heavily, his mind struggling against the decision forming inside him. "I have to," he whispered. For the first time, Ubong stepped beyond the line he had been trying to avoid. He watched carefully. A woman passed by holding a small bag. Ubong's eyes followed it. His hands trembled. "This is for Anieti," he told himself. Just this once. As the woman slowed near a stall, distracted by something, Ubong moved, quick, silent. He grabbed the edge of the bag. "Hey!" The woman turned suddenly, her voice sharp. Ubong froze. Their eyes met. For a second, everything stopped. Then fear took over. Ubong ran. "Thief!" the woman shouted. People turned. Voices rose. Ubong ran faster, his feet slipping on the wet ground, his heart racing. "Stop him!" He didn't look back. He ran until the voices faded, until his lungs burned and his legs felt like they would give out. Finally, he stopped bending over, gasping for air. The bag was still in his hand. His fingers tightened around it. Slowly, he opened it. Inside was a small amount of money. Not much, but enough. Enough to try. Ubong stood there, the rain still falling around him, his chest rising and falling. "I didn't want to do this," he whispered, but there was no time to think about it. He ran again, this time toward a small roadside pharmacy he had seen before. The man behind the counter looked at him suspiciously as he approached. "What do you want?" Medicine, Ubong said quickly. "For fever." The man glanced at his soaked clothes, his dirty face. "You have money." Ubong nodded, pulling out the crumpled notes. The man took them, counted quickly. then handed over a small packet. "This is all you get for that." Ubong grabbed it without question. "Thank you," he said, already turning to run. When he returned to the abandoned house, the rain had slowed, but the damage remained. Water covered parts of the floor. Agnieszka lay where he had left her, her body still, her breathing shallow. Agnieszka Ubong rushed to her side. Her eyes opened slowly. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you I would." He said, his voice breaking slightly. He helped her sit up carefully, giving her the medicine with what little water he had managed to collect. "Drink," he said gently. She obeyed, though her hands trembled. Ubong sat beside her, watching closely. Minutes passed, then more. Slowly, her breathing began to steady. Not completely, but enough. Ubong let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "You're okay," he said softly. "You're going to be okay." Agnieszka leaned against him, her eyes closing again. "Ubong," she murmured. "Yes, I knew you would come back." His chest tightened. He looked down at her, his mind heavy. She didn't know what he had done. She didn't know what it had cost him. And maybe that was better. That night, as Agnieszka slept, Ubong sat awake. The rain had stopped, but the air remained cold. He stared at his hands. They were still shaking, not from the cold, from what he had done. "I stole," he whispered. The word felt heavy, wrong, but then he looked at Agnieszka, at her small body curled up beside him, and the weight shifted. "If I didn't," he said quietly, "she would get worse." He closed his eyes briefly. "I will do anything," he said, "anything to keep her alive." And in that moment, Ubong crossed a line he could not uncross, not because he wanted to, but because the world had left him no other choice. Outside, the city moved on unaware. Inside the broken house, a boy sat in the darkness, no longer just surviving, but changing, becoming something harder, stronger, and far more alone than he should ever have been. The courtroom was larger than Etim remembered, or maybe it only felt that way because everything else in his life had become so small. He sat in the defendant's section again, though this time the chains were gone. His hands rested on the wooden table in front of him, steady but tense, as if they did not yet trust the possibility of freedom. The air carried the faint smell of polished wood and quiet expectation. People filled the benches, lawyers, observers, a few reporters. Faces blurred together, but the weight of their attention did not. This was not his first time in this room, but it felt like the first time anyone was truly listening. Inyobong Essien stood a few steps away, reviewing her notes one last time. She looked calm, but Etim had learned to recognize the signs, the slight tightening of her jaw, the careful way she inhaled before speaking. She had prepared for this moment with everything she had. And still, it would not be easy. Across the room, the legal team, representing the warehouse company, sat with quiet confidence. Their suits were sharp, their expressions controlled. At the center of them sat a man Etim had never seen before, but immediately knew. Chief Bako Danjuma. He did not look at Etim. He did not need to. Power did not acknowledge those it believed beneath it. The judge entered, and the room rose. "Be seated." The sound of chairs settling echoed softly. Inyobong stepped forward when her name was called. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear, steady. "We are here today to review the conviction of Mr. Etim Bassi, who was sentenced 8 years ago for theft under circumstances we now believe to be fundamentally flawed." The opposing counsel stood almost immediately. "Your Honor, the conviction was based on solid evidence." Inyobong raised a hand slightly. "Evidence that we will demonstrate was manipulated." A ripple moved through the room. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Proceed." Inyobong took a breath. "For years, Mr. Bassi has maintained his innocence," she continued, "until recently his claims were dismissed due to lack of proof. Today we present new findings that challenge the integrity of the original case." She gestured toward the documents. These records show irregularities in warehouse access logs. Codes used at times when Mr. Bassi was not present. Duplicate entries. Impossible timestamps. The opposing lawyer stepped forward, his tone sharp. "Technical errors," he said. Nothing more. Inyobong did not flinch. "Then perhaps you can explain why these errors appear consistently across multiple cases involving the same company," she replied. The room grew quieter. She continued, her voice gaining strength. "We have identified a pattern of accusations made against low-level employees. Each case follows the same structure. Each ends with a conviction, and each removes scrutiny from the company itself." The judge's expression shifted slightly. "Do you have witnesses to support this claim?" he asked. Inyobong paused. For a brief moment, the weight of that question pressed down on her. No direct witnesses willing to testify at this time, she admitted. "But we do have corroborating evidence from prior cases, as well as access logs obtained directly from the company's internal system." The opposing counsel seized the moment. "So no witnesses," he said, almost smiling. "Only speculation built on selective data." Etim felt his chest tighten. The room seemed to lean in. Inyobong stood still for a second. Then she spoke again. "Not speculation," she said quietly. "Pattern." She turned slightly, her gaze moving toward the section where Chief Bako Danjuma sat. For a pattern to exist, there must be a source. For the first time, Chief Bako shifted. Just slightly. But it was enough. The judge noticed. "Are you suggesting involvement from the company's leadership?" he asked. Inyobong met his eyes. "I am suggesting that the system protecting that leadership has allowed innocent men to be punished," she said. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Dangerous. The opposing counsel's tone hardened. "This is an accusation without proof. My client's name should not be dragged into, then let him speak," Inyobong said suddenly. The interruption cut through the room. Silence followed. The judge looked toward Chief Bako. "Would you like to respond?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, Chief Bako Danjuma stood. He adjusted his jacket with calm precision, his face composed. "I run a large organization," he said, his voice measured. "I cannot be held responsible for every action taken by every employee." His gaze moved briefly toward Inyobong. "These claims are unfortunate," he continued. "But they are not evidence of wrongdoing at the level you are implying." He sat down again. The room exhaled, controlled, confident, untouched. Etim felt something inside him sink slightly. This was the man. The one whose shadow had stretched over his life for 8 years, and he looked untouchable. Inyobong remained standing. She did not look defeated, but Etim could see the weight pressing against her now. Without a witness, without something undeniable. The truth might not be enough. The judge leaned back. "I will review the submitted evidence," he said. "This court will reconvene after recess." The gavel struck, and just like that, everything paused. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, heavier. Etim stood beside Inyobong, his hands clasped together. "You did everything you could," he said quietly. Inyobong shook her head slightly. "Not yet." She looked at him, her eyes focused. "We are close," she said. "I can feel it." Etim nodded, though doubt had begun to creep in. "What if it's not enough?" he asked. Inyobong didn't answer immediately. Because she didn't know. Across the corridor, Chief Bako exited the room surrounded by his legal team. He did not look at them as he passed, but one of the men beside him did. Just for a second. And in that glance, there was something. Not confidence, not indifference. Something closer to concern. Inyobong saw it too. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "They're not as comfortable as they pretend," she said under her breath. Etim followed her gaze. "Then why does it feel like we're losing?" he asked. Inyobong turned back to him. "Because the truth doesn't win quickly," she said. "It fights." She looked down at her notes again. Somewhere in all of this, there was one missing piece. One thing that could turn everything. She just hadn't found it yet. and time was running out. Inside the courtroom, the decision would soon be made, and outside in a broken house far from all of this, two children were still waiting for a father who didn't know if he would ever reach them again. The judgment came quietly. No dramatic pause, no sudden shift in the room. Just the steady, measured voice of the judge returning after recess, carrying words that would change everything, yet somehow feel almost unreal. After reviewing the newly presented evidence, the judge began adjusting his glasses slightly. This court finds that there are sufficient irregularities in the original conviction of Mr. Etimbassi. Etim's breath caught. He did not move. He did not blink. For a moment, he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. The judge continued. The access records presented indicate inconsistencies that cannot be dismissed as simple technical error. Combined with the lack of direct witness testimony and the questionable chain of evidence regarding the alleged stolen funds. A pause. Then this court overturns the conviction. The words landed, soft but final. Etim felt something inside him collapse, not in pain, but in release. 8 years. 8 years of silence, of disbelief, of holding on to something no one else would see. And now, it was over. "You are hereby declared not guilty," the judge said. The room shifted. Voices murmured, chairs moved, but Etim heard none of it. He sat there, frozen, his hands still resting on the table, as if they did not yet belong to him. "Not guilty." The words echoed again. Inyobong placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Etim," she said softly. He turned to her slowly. "It's done," she said. His eyes filled not with tears yet, but with something deeper. Something that had been held back for too long. "Thank you," he whispered. Inyobong nodded, though her expression carried more than relief, because she knew something Etim did not. This was not the end. Across the room, Chief Bako Danjuma stood, his expression unchanged. He spoke quietly to his legal team, then walked out without looking back. Untouched, for now. The prison gates opened again, but this time, Etim stepped through them as a free man. The sunlight felt different, brighter, wider, almost too much. He paused just outside the gate, his eyes scanning the open space before him. Cars passed, people moved, life continued. No one was waiting, no familiar face, no voice calling his name, just the world, moving on. Etim stood there for a long moment, his chest rising slowly as he took in the air, real air, not the heavy stillness of prison. "I'm free," he said quietly to himself. But the words felt incomplete, because freedom without direction was just another kind of emptiness. Inyobong stepped beside him. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked gently. Etim hesitated. "My home," he said. Then he stopped, because he didn't know if it was still there. He didn't know if anything was. The journey back felt longer than it should have. The roads were familiar, but changed. New buildings stood where old ones had been. Shops had different names. Faces were unfamiliar. Time had moved on without him. Etim walked slowly, his eyes searching every corner, every street, every memory trying to find its place again. When he finally reached the area where his home had been, his steps slowed, then stopped. The house was gone. In its place stood a different structure, newer, larger, occupied by people he did not know. Etim stared at it, his mind struggling to accept what he was seeing. This is not," he murmured. He approached cautiously. A woman standing outside looked at him with mild curiosity. "Excuse me," Etim said. "The family that used to live here, Etimbassi." The woman shook her head. "I don't know that name. We moved here 3 years ago." 3 years. Etim's chest tightened. "Do you know where they went?" he asked. She shrugged. "No. People come and go. Just like that." Gone. Etim stepped back slowly. The ground beneath him felt unsteady. "Where would she go?" he whispered to himself. He turned away, his mind racing. The market. She had worked at the market. Maybe someone there would know. The market was as busy as ever. Voices filled the air. Vendors called out. Buyers moved from stall to stall. But to Etim it all felt distant. He walked through, slowly his eyes scanning faces, searching for something familiar. Finally he saw someone he recognized, an older woman who used to sell near Ekayet. He approached quickly. "Mama," he said, "please do you remember Ekayet Basse?" The woman looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then recognition flickered. "Etim," she said, surprised. He nodded eagerly. "Yes, it's me." Her expression shifted relief. Then something else, something heavier. "You came back," she said softly. "Yes," he replied quickly. "Where is she? Where are my children?" The woman hesitated. Etim felt his heart begin to pound. "Please," he said, "tell me." She looked around briefly, then lowered her voice. "Things were not easy after you left," she said. "People talked. Business became bad. She tried. She really tried." Etim's hands clenched slightly. "What happened?" he asked. The woman sighed. "She lost the house," she said. "Could not pay rent. After that, I don't know exactly. I heard she moved around, stayed with relatives for a while. And the children," Etim pressed. "They were with her," the woman said. "Until..." She stopped. Etim leaned closer. "Until what?" The woman's eyes filled with hesitation. "I heard she disappeared," she said finally. "One day she was just gone." Etim felt the world tilt. "Gone," he repeated. The woman nodded slowly. "No one knows where she went." Silence fell. The noise of the market faded into something distant. Etim stood there, his thoughts unraveling. "No," he said under his breath. "No, she wouldn't leave them." But doubt crept in, because nothing made sense anymore. He looked at the woman again. "My children," he said. "Do you know where they are?" She shook her head. "I'm sorry." Etim walked away, slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last. No home, no wife, no children, 8 years, gone. He stopped at the edge of the road, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar world around him. "Where do I start?" he whispered. Then something came back to him. A memory. A small detail. The unfinished building near the outskirts, the place Ekayet once mentioned when they had been forced to leave temporarily years ago. "It's not safe," she had said back then. "But it's something." Etim's eyes sharpened slightly. Something. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He turned and began to walk. Faster now, driven by something he could not fully explain. Hope, fear, desperation, all at once. Because somewhere in this city, his children were still out there, and he was running out of time to find them. The city did not slow down for Etim Basse. It did not notice the way his steps grew faster, or the way his eyes searched every passing face with rising urgency. It did not hear the questions repeating in his mind over and over, growing louder with each second. "Where are they? Where are my children?" He moved through the streets with a kind of restless determination, guided only by fragments of memory. The unfinished building, the outskirts, the places people went when they had nowhere left to go. But 8 years was a long time. Too long. Everything had shifted. Shops had changed. Roads had been widened. Entire sections of the city felt unfamiliar, and with every wrong turn, every dead end, the weight in his chest grew heavier. Think, he whispered to himself, stopping briefly at a crossroads. Think like her. Ekayet would not choose a place because it was comfortable. She would choose a place because it was available, because it was hidden, because it cost nothing. Etim turned toward a quieter road, one that led away from the crowded market and into older parts of the city where buildings stood abandoned or half-finished, left behind by owners who had run out of money or hope. The air felt different there. Still, almost forgotten. He walked slower now, his eyes scanning carefully. One building, then another. Each one carried the same signs, cracked walls, broken windows, doors hanging loose. Places no one wanted. places people like his family might have ended up. His heart began to beat faster. He approached the first one cautiously. "Ubong," he called softly. No answer. He stepped inside. Dust. Silence. Nothing. He moved on. The second building. Nothing. The third. Still nothing. With each empty space, the fear inside him grew. What if I'm too late? The thought slipped in before he could stop it. He shook his head sharply. No. He kept moving. The sun had begun to lower in the sky when he reached another structure, larger than the others, but clearly abandoned. Part of the roof had collapsed. The door leaned slightly to one side. Something about it made him pause. He didn't know why, but he felt it. He stepped closer. The ground outside showed faint signs of movement footprints, small ones mixed with older marks. His breath caught. "Ubong," he called again, louder this time. Still nothing, but he heard something else. A faint sound. Inside, a movement. Etim's heart began to pound so hard he could hear it in his ears. He pushed the door open slowly. It creaked loudly. The sound echoed through the empty space. For a moment, there was silence. Then a small shift. Etim stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. "Ubong," he said again, his voice trembling now. "Anyeti." A figure moved in the corner. Etim froze. A boy stepped forward slowly. His body tense, his eyes cautious. Thin, dirty, older than Etim remembered, but not in the way a child should grow. Their eyes met. Time stopped. "Papa," the boy whispered. Etim felt something inside him break open. "Ubong," he breathed. The name barely left his lips before he was moving. He crossed the space quickly, dropping to his knees in front of the boy. "It's me," he said, his voice shaking. "It's Papa." Ubong stared at him, his expression caught between disbelief and recognition. For a second, he didn't move. Then suddenly he stepped forward. Etim pulled him into his arms. Tight. Too tight, as if letting go would make him disappear again. "You're here," Ubong said, his voice cracking. "You came back. I told you I would," Etim whispered. But even as he said it, his eyes moved past Ubong, searching. "Where is your sister?" he asked quickly. Ubong's expression changed. Something dark flickered across it. "She's inside," he said softly. Etim's chest tightened. "Take me to her." Ubong nodded and turned, leading him deeper into the building. Each step felt heavier. The air inside was thick, still carrying the faint smell of dampness and neglect. Then Etim saw her. Anyeti lay on the ground. Her small body curled slightly, a thin cloth covering her. She looked smaller, weaker, not like the little girl he remembered. Etim dropped to his knees beside her. "Anyeti," he said softly. Her eyes opened slowly. For a moment they seemed unfocused. Then they found him. She blinked. Once. Twice. "Papa," she whispered. Etim felt his throat close. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm here, my child." Tears filled her eyes. "You came back," she said, her voice barely a sound. He nodded quickly, reaching out his hand, trembling as it touched her face. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." She tried to smile. "I knew you would," she said. The words shattered him. Etim pulled both children into his arms, holding them as tightly as he could. And in that moment, he understood. Everything. The hunger, the fear, the years they had spent alone. It was written on their bodies. In the way Ubong stood too alert. In the way Anyeti's voice had grown so soft. In the emptiness that lingered in their eyes. They had survived, but at a cost. No child should ever pay. Etim closed his eyes, his arms tightening around them. "I will never leave you again," he said. His voice was low, but filled with something unbreakable. Ubong nodded against him. Anyeti closed her eyes again, resting in his arms. For the first time in years, they were not alone. But even in that moment of reunion, Etim knew something else. This was not the end of their suffering. It was only the beginning of what came next. Because healing would take more than finding each other again. Etim did not let go of them for a long time. The broken house around them seemed to disappear as he held his children close, his arms wrapped tightly around their fragile bodies as if he could somehow shield them from everything they had already endured. Ubong leaned into him without resistance, but his body remained tense, as though he had forgotten what it meant to feel safe. Anyati, weaker, barely had the strength to hold on. Yet she stayed pressed against him, as if afraid that if she loosened her grip, he might vanish again. For a moment, time slowed, then reality returned. Etim pulled back just enough to look at them properly, and what he saw made his chest tighten painfully. Ubong's face had changed. The innocence that once lived in his eyes had been replaced by something harder, something older. His cheeks were thinner, his skin marked by dirt and sun, his clothes worn beyond recognition. This was no longer the curious boy who used to ask endless questions. This was a child who had learned to survive. Anyeti. Etim turned to her again, his breath catching. She looked smaller than he remembered her frame too, light, her skin pale beneath the dust. Even her breathing sounded fragile, like it took effort just to remain steady. "How long?" Etim whispered, his voice breaking. "How long have you been here?" Ubong lowered his gaze. "A long time," he said quietly. Etim shook his head slightly, as if trying to reject the answer. "Where is your mother?" he asked. The question lingered in the air. Ubong did not respond immediately. Etim's heart began to pound again. "Ubong," he said more firmly. "Where is Ekaeta?" Ubong swallowed. "She left," he said. Etim felt the words hit him, but they did not fully settle. "What do you mean?" She left. Ubong's hands clenched slightly at his sides. "She said we should take care of each other," he said slowly. "Then she didn't come back." Silence followed. Etim stared at him, his mind struggling to process it. "No," he said under his breath. She wouldn't leave you." But even as he spoke, doubt crept in, because everything else had already fallen apart. Anyeti shifted slightly, her weak voice cutting through the tension. "Mama cried," she whispered, "before she went." Etim closed his eyes for a moment. The image formed in his mind. Ekaet exhausted, broken, making a decision no mother should ever have to make. Not because she didn't love them, but because she had nothing left. Etim exhaled slowly, his shoulders sinking under the weight of it. "I should have been here," he said quietly. "I should have protected you." Ubong shook his head quickly. "You didn't leave us," he said. "They took you." Etim looked at him. The boy's voice was steady, but there was pain beneath it. "You came back," Ubong added. "That's what matters." The words should have brought comfort, but they didn't, because Etim could see everything that had happened in his absence. Not just hear it, see it. "Tell me," he said softly. "Tell me everything." Ubong hesitated. Then slowly he began. He spoke of the days after Ekaet disappeared. The waiting, the hunger, the fear, the way they had moved from place to place, before finding this abandoned house. He spoke of searching for food, of being chased away, of learning where to go, where not to go. Etim listened, his expression tightening with every word. Then Ubong paused. There was a time, he said, his voice quieter now, when Anyeti got very sick. Etim's attention sharpened. "What happened?" he asked. Ubong looked down at his hands. "I tried to ask people for help," he said, "but no one listened." Etim felt a slow anger begin to rise. And then he pressed. Ubong hesitated again. Then he spoke. "I stole." The word fell heavily between them. Etim froze. Ubong's voice remained low, almost ashamed. "I didn't want to," he said quickly. But she was getting worse. I didn't know what else to do. Etim stared at him. For a moment he said nothing, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he understood. He understood too well. Slowly, Etim reached out and placed a hand on Ubong's shoulder. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly. Ubong looked up surprised. "I didn't want her to die," he said. Etim shook his head slightly. "You kept her alive," he replied. The tension in Ubong's face shifted slightly, though the weight did not fully leave. Etim turned his attention back to Anieti. "We need to get you out of here," he said gently. "You need proper care." Anieti nodded faintly, her eyes half closed. Etim stood slowly, his movements careful. "We're leaving," he said. Ubong looked around the broken space. "This is all we have," he said. Etim shook his head. "No," he replied. "It's what you had." He extended his hand. "Come." Ubong hesitated for only a moment before taking it. Anieti leaned against Etim as he carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than she should have been. Far too light. Etim's jaw tightened. "Hold on," he whispered to her. She nodded weakly. As they stepped outside, the evening air felt different. The sky was dimming, the city beginning to glow with scattered lights. But for Etim, everything had changed. Because now he knew, not imagined, not guessed, knew what his children had lived through, what had been taken from them, and something inside him, something that had been building quietly since the courtroom finally broke free. Not into despair, into resolve. "This ends now," he said under his breath. Ubong looked up at him. "What did you say?" Etim shook his head slightly. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Because as he walked forward, carrying his daughter holding his son's hand, he was no longer just a man who had been wronged. He was a father who had seen the cost of that injustice, and he would not allow it to go unanswered. Not anymore. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet urgency. Etim pushed through the doors with Anieti in his arms, Ubong close behind him, their footsteps echoing against the clean-tiled floor. The brightness of the place felt overwhelming after the dimness of the abandoned house. Nurses moved quickly from one bed to another, voices low but efficient. "Please," Etim said, his voice tight. "My daughter, she's sick." A nurse approached, her eyes immediately scanning Anieti's condition. She didn't ask many questions. She didn't hesitate. "Bring her here," she said, guiding them toward a bed. Etim laid Anieti down carefully, his hands lingering for a moment, as if afraid to let go. "Stay with her," the nurse added. "We'll take care of the rest." Etim stepped back, but his eyes never left his daughter. Doctors came. Equipment followed. Voices rose and fell in controlled urgency. Ubong stood beside him, silent. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked quietly. Etim swallowed hard. "She will be," he said. This time it wasn't a promise he could make alone. Hours passed. Time stretched in a way Etim had not felt since prison, slow, uncertain, heavy with everything that could go wrong. Finally, a doctor approached. "She's weak," he said. "Malnutrition infection." But she came in time. Etim's chest tightened. "She will recover?" he asked. The doctor nodded. "With proper care, yes." Etim closed his eyes briefly. For the first time since he had found them, he allowed himself to breathe. "Thank you," he whispered. The days that followed were different. Anieti remained in the hospital, her strength slowly returning under careful attention. Ubong stayed close, though the tension in his body took longer to fade. Even when sitting in a chair beside the bed, he seemed alert, watching everything as if expecting something to go wrong. Etim stayed with them, every moment. He did not leave unless he had to, and when he did, it was only to take the next step in something he had already decided. Justice. Iniobong met him outside the hospital one afternoon. "You found them," she said softly. Etim nodded. "They're alive," he replied. But his expression carried more than relief. "They suffered," he added, "because of what was done to me." Iniobong's gaze lowered slightly. "I know." Etim looked at her, his eyes steady now. "It's not over." he said. She met his gaze again. No, she agreed. It's not. With the evidence already in motion, Inyobong pushed forward. The access logs, the patterns, the inconsistencies. But this time something had changed. There was attention. Public attention. Word of Etim's case had begun to spread. A wrongly imprisoned man. 8 years lost. A system that had failed him. People were watching now, and that made silence harder to maintain. New information surfaced. A former employee, someone who had stayed hidden before, came forward anonymously. Documents were leaked. Financial records began to reveal connections that had once been buried, and at the center of it all, Chief Bako Danjuma. The pressure grew. Slowly at first, then all at once. Investigations were opened. Questions were asked in places that had once remained quiet. And for the first time, the system that had protected him began to crack. Etim stood in the courtroom again. But this time he was not the one on trial. Chief Bako Danjuma sat where Etim once had. The room felt different, not because it had changed, but because the balance inside it had shifted. Inyobong stood once more, her voice clear. This is not just about one man, she said. This is about a system that allowed power to erase truth, that allowed innocent lives to be broken. She gestured toward Etim. 8 years, she said, taken from him, and while he was gone, his children were left to survive alone. The words carried through the room. Etim stood still. He did not speak. He did not need to, because everything that had happened was already visible. The judge listened carefully. The evidence was no longer fragments. It was complete. The access logs, the financial trails, the testimonies, all pointing to the same truth. Chief Bako Danjuma had not just allowed it, he had orchestrated it. The ruling came days later, firm, unavoidable. Chief Bako was found guilty of fraud, manipulation of evidence, and abuse of corporate power. The sentence was long, but for Etim, it was not about the number of years. It was about something else, closure. Months later, life had begun to rebuild itself. Not perfectly, not completely, but steadily. Anyeti recovered. Her strength returned slowly, her laughter softer at first, then stronger as time passed. Ubong changed too. The hardness in his eyes did not disappear overnight, but it began to ease, replaced by something that had been missing for too long. Safety. Etim found work again, not at a warehouse, somewhere smaller, honest. He worked quietly, but with purpose, because everything he did now was for them. One evening they sat together outside their small new home. It wasn't large, it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Anyeti leaned against Etim, her head resting gently on his shoulder. Ubong sat nearby, watching the sky. Papa Anyeti said softly, "Are we safe now?" Etim looked at her, then at Ubong, then back at the fading light above them. "Yes," he said, and this time, it was true. Some stories are not just about survival. They are about what survival costs. Etim Bassi lost 8 years of his life to a system that chose power over truth. But the deeper tragedy was not only what was taken from him, it was what happened in his absence. 2 children left behind, forced to grow up in a world that showed them no mercy. And yet, they survived. Not because the world was kind, but because love, real love, does not disappear even when everything else does. This story reminds us of something we often forget. Justice may be delayed, it may be buried, it may even seem impossible, but it is never truly gone. And sometimes all it takes is one voice, one person who refuses to look away, to bring it back into the light. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect. Where are you watching from? What time is it in your part of the world? Your voice matters too. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and if you believe in stories that bring truth, hope, and healing, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because somewhere out there, another story like this is waiting to be told.